Hello and welcome to Stork'd, the podcast, in which we explore the many ways to build and define family. This is Julia, and today I want to introduce Chelsea London Lloyd. I want you to imagine as a young child, watching your parent slowly die of a debilitating disease, ALS. First, you watch him lose his arms, and then later some other movement, eventually speech. And imagine the relationship you might have with grief if you have navigated seeing a parent slowly pass away in this way. That's Chelsea. And the net result is this dynamic, wonderful, beautiful human who is funny as all get out and who relies on or rests in her humor as a tool to talk about grief through a podcast called Dying of Laughter and as a stand-up comedian and actress. Chelsea and I became friendly with one another a couple of years ago through the podcasting world, and I have just loved her. This woman brings so much heart to everything that she does. And she started to occupy this space through her podcast and just through her volunteerism and her works in the community as an unofficial grief counselor or somebody who is holding space for grief, who talks about grief. I think about her and her relationship to grief in the same way I think about myself and the Stork'd podcast and my relationship and the podcast's relationship to families. This important mission-driven, all-encompassing, let's talk about grief, let's talk about families. So if you like my work, you will definitely like hers. What's really special about Chelsea, however, is not just her experience with grief as a child growing up and the space that she now holds for others in their grieving, but also that she stepped up to support a child whose mother had breast cancer and that parent ultimately passed away. And this episode covers mentoring a grieving child in a way that it's powerful. This is a really special episode. I hope you enjoy it. Definitely take a listen and check out her podcast too while you're at it. And I hope you enjoy it. Here is Chelsea. By the way, if you love this one, and you will because she's hilarious, don't forget to leave us a great review anywhere you listen to podcasts. Please share this with a friend and sign up for our newsletter.
Chelsea, thank you so much for joining us. When I see you, I see somebody who's so multifaceted, and I could run through your litany of professional and personal accomplishments. But I also see somebody who's really dynamic underneath all of that. So instead of reciting your amazing bio, why don't you tell us who you are?
Oh my gosh, who you are. Very loaded question. Who am I right now in the scheme of my life? I'm an actress and comedian in Los Angeles. I'm from San Francisco, but my parents are from New York. My sister lives in New York. I was named after New York City. So I have a very New York personality, but I've never lived in New York. So that's my fun fact. And I'm also volunteering as a grief counselor, primarily online. I work one-to-one with a child through Walk with Sally, which is the equivalent of the Big Sisters program for families impacted by cancer. So I have the side of me that is in traditional entertainment that I've been doing for most of my life as an actor and now comedian in my young adulthood. Well, now I'm a regular adult, but started in young adulthood. And the grief is just a completely separate thing. The podcast that I do, Dying of Laughter, is the intersection of those two things.
I love that. Yes, I knew that you could handle the big, hard question, who are you? But I like
Thank you. We got through that.
You got through it. Yeah, not everyone can handle that, but I really like that you're presenting these two sides of yourself. You've got the entertainment industry, and then you've got this person who sits with and spends a lot of time guiding other people through grief. So let's start with that. Let's dive into the hard, difficult, messy stuff.
Let's do it.
Immediately.
Here for that. Yeah. Immediately.
Tell us, grief is this important topic. You're tackling it on your podcast. You're spending your free time counseling others through grief. What is grief?
Ooh, these are good. Who are you and what is grief?
I know.
It's no joke. I love it.
Normally they're not this intense, but God, you're bringing out this level of let me hit you with really hard, open-ended crap immediately. Yeah, but define what grief means for you. What does it mean to be a grief counselor? What does that mean to do that work?
So I would say that grief is the deep emotional response to a circumstance, primarily the loss of someone close to you in the context of death. However, that can be expanded to, of course, many other things that you lose in your life. Loss of relationship, loss of identity, loss of your physical space, in COVID, loss of connection to human beings, et cetera, et cetera. My work as a volunteer grief counselor, which I will say is very different than being a therapist. Of course, I always defer people to therapists first and foremost. The reality is not everyone will have access that, or there are X, Y, or Z barriers from preventing people from seeing a traditional therapist. So I come to people as a peer-led volunteer, right? So I'm leading peers 20s through 40s through the dinner party, and we are having roundtable discussions on Zoom about the losses of our parents and siblings. I primarily do grief groups that are like finding the funny in your grief. I primarily work with people who have lost parents just because that's my specific experience, having lost my dad, but everything in between have expanded a bit to loss of spouses and friends, which is, we can talk about later. That's a whole other thing. And then specifically with the child that I work with, I was assigned to mentor her when her mom was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer during the pandemic. And I've been with her through the loss of her mom. So that's been really heavy. But yeah, some of the pillars include the dinner party, online grief groups, one-to-one with a specific child. But I think something that I've learned from all of this is why me? Why now? So when I first started volunteering in grief spaces, I was like, well, why the fuck would I do that? Just because I lost my dad. But I also thought, if not me, who? If not now, when? And I think that, I'm talking about American culture here, I think that everyone can show up in volunteer spaces more than they think they can. Certainly not everyone has the time, depending on your financial situation. However, there are a lot of people that do have the time that I just think are not showing up because we don't value volunteership in America. It's not something that's ingrained within us. Like, please volunteer. Maybe when you're in high school to try and get into a college, you do some volunteer programs. So yeah, I think it's really important for all of us to step into our power in some way in a volunteer space. How can you do that? I have thoughts. That's a whole other podcast, but
yeah, I appreciate several things. One is you're giving us a little bit of a call to action, not to do performative volunteering, like to get into a college or university, but to really identify those things where you can be of service to others. Volunteership is really service. And sometimes it's in a formal context, and sometimes it's just showing up and being available to somebody when they need you. And so what I'm hearing is through an organization, you've got some formal ways to show up and to be present, especially in the really hard stuff like grief. And you started by saying one of the topics that you cover that you do really well with is finding your funny through grief. How do you maintain sanity in showing up in these hard places? How do you find your funny in these really difficult moments?
I personally find tragedy hilarious when it's been a long time. Okay, so I always caveat that. I always say, if you just lost someone and you're not laughing, don't worry. Obviously, when things first happen, it's really, really heavy. So comedy equals tragedy plus time. So my dad was diagnosed with ALS. Sometimes I say when I was 4, sometimes I say when I was 8. He technically was diagnosed when I was 8. He was dropping forks and having symptoms since I was 4. So he thinks that it was missed for several years before his diagnosis. Okay, so either way, I was very young.
So you were dealing with illness in your family as you were growing up as a kid.
Yes, definitely. And he had ALS through when I was 19, when he died.
For those who don't know, can you give a little definition of what ALS is?
Yes. Okay. ALS is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. It is also called Lou Gehrig's disease, named after the famous baseball player who died from it. Your muscles eventually deteriorate. That's the best way that I can describe it. So you have muscles and they atrophy, they get weaker and weaker until they essentially are just nothing. So you get skinnier, and you think if you don't have muscles, your body looks very floppy. So you lose motor function and you ultimately die because lose function in your lungs and your heart, essentially. So some people lose function in their motor skills first, in the area around their speech. So some people lose their speech first and are still walking around. Some people lose function in their body first and can still speak. So that was the situation that my dad was in. So his arms went first, which is the best case scenario because you can still walk around. But I have the very earliest images of my dad are without his arms working. I don't have any memories of my dad having arms. I'm laughing right now because that's hilarious, just the way that I'm describing it.
It's interesting because what you're saying is that from a very young age, your dad had a degenerative disease that you knew would lead to losing him.
Yeah.
And so you had to grow up not just witnessing the deterioration, but also with the knowledge that at one point you're going to have to say goodbye. How does a kid process all that?
You obsess over it your entire life and start a grief podcast later in life, I guess. It was just something that I always thought about. I don't think I consciously thought about his death as much as I thought about his differences, right? So it was just like, okay, why does he looks weird? He's acting weird. Like all the emotional problems that come from having physical problems is unimaginable, even to me who have witnessed it. Of course, unless you've been paralyzed yourself, you just can't even imagine it. So, then he couldn't drive, then he couldn't do this, then he couldn't shower, then he couldn't move, then he's in a wheelchair, then he moves to a care home. Like all of these differences in these things forced me to think about mortality subconsciously, and then consciously forced me to think about the fact that life is short and that things change, things that we tend to avoid. I will also share that my mom had breast cancer at the time. So she was diagnosed when I was 8. So technically they were diagnosed the same year, although he had been having, like I said, issues before that. So she also lost her hair and was in chemo and lost her boobs and things like that. So it was just like a lot of uncomfortable feelings for a kid. I was also the oldest. My little sister, who was 2 years behind me, was devastated by all of this, like screaming tantrums, like just so affected. And so I had to figure out how to be the one to like get it together, because there's literally another kid screaming and crying. So yeah, those are some of my earliest memories, not the most pleasant, but I'm grateful that I've been able to find a comedic thread through all of this. My dad was a really funny guy. Like he didn't take himself very seriously. Like he would make jokes about his paralysis. So I think that was a huge influence on me. And there were times that like it wasn't funny, like for sure. So I think comedy was either A, what I was seeing him use as a tool. So I mimicked that, and it allowed me to understand that comedy is okay. And for the times when he wasn't being funny about it, that was very uncomfortable. So that was another coping mechanism that I would use because I didn't feel like I had another choice. And lastly, I feel that seeing things through a comedic lens was a way for me to cope, because I needed to make sure that the adults knew that I was okay. So me cracking a joke is a way to do that, because adults had questions for me, like in carpool, like, how are you feeling? And what's going on? Or like really bad questions that weren't, how are you feeling? But just like, what's the latest? Like, like who's in the hospital now? And so I had to joke my way through that. So that's where the comedy started.
That's really interesting. And I love the connection to your dad through comedy, which you talk about quite a bit in your podcasts. When you're being humorous or interviewing guests, you often reference the humor that he brought to the table during his illness, which is a really nice, because now we get to see this wonderful, human, hilarious, comedic person who shows up in part because of this influence that you've had by this amazing person who was your father. So you've just shared quite a bit. You've shared about the journey of 2 illnesses and how that affected you as a kid. You've also hinted that there were a lot of adults in your life who I am assuming were stepping up to support your family by doing carpools or maybe doing some other things. How did that community come together for you, or did they?
Yeah, so that's actually something that I really have strong opinions about. So there were definitely a lot of people involved. I mean, it really takes a village when there's someone with a disability. He was completely paralyzed for, almost a decade. So we're talking not lifting a finger, cannot turn your head, cannot change the channel. So just try and imagine the amount of care that needs. And my mom was the caregiver for a number of years till the point that it becomes impossible. I mean, he also was 6'3" or 6'4", I don't remember, but just a bigger guy. And my mom couldn't even lift him. I mean, she couldn't even get him into a shower. So, in comes care and nurses and people to help with that until eventually he moved out. When I was 12, he moved 45 minutes away into a care home, which unfortunately not everyone has access to that. That's expensive. And it's just all exhausted. I mean, it's just bullshit. It's all like, okay, well, what are people going to do? So, I mean, that's what he did, but it's like, that's not covered. But then it's like, my mom is doing other things and working and she can't do it. So, I mean, ALS is a tremendous burden emotionally, physically, financially, as are other diseases. So he lived there.
We were talking a little bit about how did your mom navigate, or how did your family navigate the day-to-day of having illness? And you're talking about the care that your mom provided and eventually needing to lean on a home, which is an option that not everyone has. But it sounds to me like there might be other people who may have stepped in, maybe grandparents, neighbors, friends. Tell us about that.
Totally. So my grandparents died. So not grandparents, but that's another thing that I like to talk about because I've also have other losses. Obviously, my dad's is first and foremost, like the most significant loss I've ever experienced, but also having seen all of my grandparents die. I also, when I was 4, a cousin of mine, she died when she was 9 and I was 4, and she died in an accident on a school field trip. And I mean, that really, really impacted me before any of this. You know, that's an extremely tragic loss, a child in an accident, right? So, you know, I have a lot of things these are all hour-long stories, but just kind of painting a broader picture to get back to your question about community. So there were people that came in and out to just physically lift my dad, and some people with more nursing experience, people that would come in and out of my life, and then some people that would help just my mom with like her own work stuff and like her own things, because now she's a single, I don't want to say single parent because she was not a single parent, but she was having some of the responsibilities shifting to single. My point about community is, so there were definitely people in and out, different people. Like sometimes I didn't know like who was picking me up, and it was like this person, and then there was like temporary staff. Like no one was like a full-time staff. So it was just like people coming in and out. So there are so many images of faces in my mind right now and names. And this is something I've like explored in therapy a lot. Actually, I hated pretty much all of them. I had really strong reactions as a kid. Like I just like had all this resentment that I feel like I was taking out on these like innocent, wonderful people that, you know, none of this is their problem. To this day, I'm not 100% sure as to why. The closest I've come is that I didn't have an emotional outlet and I wasn't able to emotionally communicate with someone about my feelings, because it's like, okay, well, my dad is like over there paralyzed, and then my mom's in whatever chemo, and then this person's picking me up and they're not a therapist. Like they're just doing their job. But I'm like, who the fuck are you? And I've given my mom feedback on this that she definitely didn't ask for. And I'm like, I wish that there had been one person, like one nanny, one babysitter, one person that had been with us for a few years. Like, I think that's what should have happened, because I did not form bonds with these people. I just didn't have a consistent touchstone. I was never in therapy at any point, which I think all kids should be at some point. So to this day, the reason that I am mentoring one child specifically is I feel like kind of creating a space that I wish that I had. Every month, you know, we do an all-day Saturday here or there, or ice skating or beach or pottery or whatever. And I'm serving an emotional need by asking her extensive questions about her mom. And I just wish that I had had that. So the good news is you can take what you wish you had and turn it into something positive later in life, because I'm really glad I am mentoring and I'm really glad I'm doing it. So,
oh my gosh, first of all, I appreciate you connecting all of the many dots. It's fascinating to me hearing you tell that part of your story, which is new to me. Knowing you now as an adult, I see you as a connector. I see you as that person who convenes and engages community, which is why I asked the community question about who was the community that showed up for you. And it's amazing that you weren't happy with that community, not because they weren't doing their best to be supportive, but because it was inconsistent. And now you are this consistent force, not just for this wonderful mentee of yours who I want to talk about, but also for the many communities you create. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Let's talk about your mentee, because we've been sort of dancing around that. And you have had, as you just shared with us, a lot of grief in your life, a lot of challenging and difficult, icky stuff. And now you get to support somebody who also is going through all of that. How do you show up for a child that needs support? And how did it come to be? How did this relationship emerge?
This relationship emerged in 2020. I was working for BuzzFeed. I was making some grief content, which was really cool. I also find that being surrounded by social media day in and day out is not best for my mental health. So I was definitely suffering mentally in 2020 for a lot of reasons, understandably. That was a rough year. My life did completely shift. Entertainment was like completely gone. Friends moving left and right. Everyone scattered across the United States, and some of them knowing it would be permanent. Like, what am I even returning to? I moved out of LA for a little bit where I'd been for so long. It was just everything was upside down. And I felt that I wanted to, to create some more meaning in all of this. And mentoring was what I turned to. I had been volunteering online in different grief spaces and previously in person. And, I had started the podcast that year, which was just like my own fun project at the time. It wasn't as big as it is now. It was just kind of like something I was doing. But I wanted to even have more one-on-one connection. So Walk with Sally is a program based out of Los Angeles that connects adults with kids in a one-to-one mentorship. It can be anyone impacted by cancer. So it's not a grief-specific organization. There are a lot of overlap with grief for sure, but it doesn't have to be that way. Like, you can mentor a child whose parent had cancer and now doesn't, but they might have been out of work for a few years. So like financially, they can't have a babysitter and you're just like a couple times a month taking them out for ice cream or something like that. Like, not everyone's dying or has died. I was matched. The name I use for her is Bianca. I was matched with Bianca because her mom had stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. My mom also had and still has stage 4 metastatic breast cancer, which returned 17 years later after her original diagnosis. She is doing well, but she will be living with cancer for the rest of her life. So they both had this diagnosis, and I felt really connected to that. They did tell me, this is heavy, right? Like, she has stage 4 breast cancer. But my mom at that point had already had it for several years. And my experiences personally, I've seen my parents just keep going and going and going with these illnesses. So I'm like, you never know. She might have it for a really long time. Let's think positive. Unfortunately, her mom died a few months after we were matched, which was not expected and not what I thought I was signing up for. The biggest challenge is that this woman, I'll say that her name is Anna. Anna and I became extremely close during this tragic year of 2020. We were regularly communicating by phone, by Zoom, by text. She would send me emails of thanks and like was overwhelmed with gratitude. She was a single mom that a stranger was helping her child. And we just like found these joyous moments in this dark year. And she would just send me these texts that were so nice. I just felt like I wasn't even like deserving of how nice she was being with me. And then she went to the hospital Christmas weekend and she didn't come out. And I hate when things around Christmas is just so like dramatic, but it's heavy and it's like, fucking God, like, are you serious? And I will say there was 2 girls. So Anna was raising 2 girls. She was raising her daughter and her niece. Don't know if that's too complicated to understand, but the 2 girls were cousins, but they were being raised as sisters. So there's 2 girls that need a home here, and eventually she died. And it's one of the most challenging experiences I have ever been a part of, even this adjacent facet. And it's been hard. And little by little, things are improving. She lives with her aunts now. She lives 3 hours away from Los Angeles, but the family comes to LA often for work. So we are able to every month still connect. The hardest part is that the 2 girls were separated. So her cousin that she was living with had a biological parent on the East Coast, was plucked over there for legal reasons. And the girls have never seen each other since. They didn't grieve together. It's been a couple years, they've just, I can't even like imagine, what was really beautiful is I don't really know what I believe in spiritually. I am Jewish, but I'm not extremely religious, which I think a lot of people might relate to at this point, perhaps more spiritual than religious. But the day that Anna died, I had plans with Bianca that day. Like, we hadn't seen each other over the holidays. And the first day back, the first week of January, that we had plans and hadn't seen each other in maybe 6 weeks, that was when she died. And it was like, what is that about? She texted me. She's like, hey, I'm really sad. My mom actually died, but if you could still like bring bagels and stuff. And just like the text is like all misspelled, like, sorry, I'm really sad right now. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I started sobbing and I was like, what the fuck? And I showed up with flowers and bagels. And I was like, look, I'm just going to drop them at their door. Like, I don't know any of these other family members, like, but I'm just going to show up and like say hi to her for a second. And I showed up and they were like, oh, hey, yeah, you're the grief person and she's out there and blah, blah, blah. So I was like, okay. And are you sure? And I ended up staying like 5 hours and we did like a ritual for her mom and like a little like ceremony. And we just like cried. We got Jamba juices. I mean, it was just, I couldn't even believe that I was there and doing it. And I was honored to be there, but I felt bad, but I knew it was the right thing. And that's how that started.
So what's amazing to me is you started the conversation by saying everyone can show up in whatever small ways you can show up. And yet you're showing up in some really tremendous big ways at big moments. Did you have an inkling at the beginning of your relationship with Bianca that it would turn into this?
No, definitely not. Especially like our first little like Zoom meeting with the organization was just like, her and her mom, we were like, hey, it's like awkward, but it's cute. I'm the one that has to be not awkward here. No, I just was like, we'll just jive and we'll just, do some fun things together. And I grew up in high school, like babysitting like everyone in town, but that had been so long ago. I hadn't regularly been interacting with a 9-year-old in so long. So I was like researching, like, what do we do? And like, we did like a book club and we would do these like online games and it was just like very light and fun. And then, I think it's about 5 months in was when her mom died. And it was about 3 months in that her mom was getting really sick. So that was not part of plan. I mean, I don't want to scare people. Like, just because you mentor a child doesn't mean their parent is going to die. There's plenty of other ways to get involved in giving back with youth that are not necessarily this heavy, but it's just been really beautiful.
But it's just that. It's the relationships that we forge always take different directions than we imagine. And in this one, you had started light, which tends to be where you're most comfortable, right? Just be comedic and find the funny in grief, et cetera. And then it got heavy and you stayed and you continued to show up. And I want to talk about that a little bit because I think it can be really hard to know how and when to show up for somebody. Can you give us some thoughts, given all of your intersections with grief, all of the work that you do? How does one show up in a difficult moment, especially with somebody who's grieving?
Checking in on people a lot later than you think can go such a long way. So I'm a calendar queen. I mark everything in my calendar. So when someone first dies, everyone in the entire world is like reaching out. Like, I just remember when my dad died, it was like, it is literally something that you hopefully only experience a few times in your life, but we all will experience this, the loss of a loved one. It is like your phone is off it's just like for hours and hours, your voicemails fill up, Facebook messages from people. I remember you from second grade and you said this, and I remember your dad at Baskin Robbins once. It is unbelievable. I mean, I'm like kind of smiling because it's like funny. Like some of these stories, you're just like, some of them are like TMI. You're like, I didn't even want to know that. So I suggest for people, mark the calendar of the anniversary of the loss so that you can reach out 1, 3, 5 years later. That can be as simple as checking in, just thinking about you. I realize it's the anniversary of this loss. I think that's really beautiful. I mean, LOL, my calendar, since I'm like whatever I am at this point in this grief spaces, my calendar is like Pilates, podcasting, have a client, reach out to Stacy, Jackson, and Sue, whose aunt and sister and cousin died. Like, I have all of these anniversaries of deaths in my calendar. My partner's like, what the fuck? Like, who died today? Like, but I write it down. I love it. I can't memorize all these deaths. So put it in your calendar and reach out to someone and just say that you're thinking about them. You can also ask open-ended questions. That's my biggest recommendation. Not like, is it good or bad? It's like, how do you feel today? Or like, what would be helpful for you? But the only thing that I think I'll add is we tend to ask like, what does that person need? Which is understandable. I do feel like with grief, it's so overwhelming. Sometimes just taking an action is acceptable. So it's like, just send the flowers, just send the cookies, just show up, like just do something, like send a book. Like I thought of you, here's a book, here's a candle. It's like, because everyone's asking, what do you need? And sometimes it's just so overwhelming. This is not just specific to grief, but anything very traumatic. It's like also just taking an action in some form is acceptable.
It's so funny because in some ways it's very similar to having a child or adopting a child.
Say that.
And
yes, I was gonna
like opposite ends of the life spectrum. And the recommendation there is not what do you need right now? Because so often you're just overwhelmed. You don't even know what you need. You don't even know what you want. But a question like, would you like bagels delivered, as you mentioned that you've done in the past, or would you like me to come do your laundry? Those are the two things I can offer you. That's an easy way for you something. Oh, I didn't even remember that I needed to do my laundry today. Come do that for me.
And thank you for tying it in. I know that your audience is, having babies or thinking about it. And yeah, I'm sure it's so overwhelming when you have a newborn and people are like, what can I do? You're like, I don't know anything. Like, it's just like, must be nice when some people just took an action, right? And just did something for you.
But, we talk on my podcast a lot about community and about family being outside the bounds of who is related to you. And caring about somebody enough to remember an anniversary such as this one is showing up. It's being family in some ways. I think the calendaring, I think of you as being this holder or keeper of all this anniversaries of loss is a really interesting visual, almost like this diary of pain, but also of love because you're showing up regularly with it. And I think the conversations about grief and loss are just as important as the conversations of birth and joy. And unfortunately, as we know, sometimes they go hand in hand.
And I will say it can get messy. So I don't want to paint the picture that I'm this like angelic grief person. People are like, we didn't think you were, but it's just like, I remember every date and it's all great. Like it can be complicated because there's some people that do want to talk to me more in depth. So like another thing that I do that's not really, I don't know, it's not an official pillar is like, I'm kind of this like name that goes around of like when someone loses someone and they want to like talk to someone their age. Like, so I just do a lot of like calls with people about their losses and also their anticipatory loss. Like I just do a lot of calls with people, but my schedule is also busy. So it can be complicated. And these are very serious things. Like someone's mom is dying like this weekend. And so I also like, there's messiness here.
There is so much in your story. We could spend hours and hours and hours talking. You have talked about anticipatory grief, which is to some extent what you dealt with as a child, and the acute grief that comes when you have immediately lost somebody. Is the grieving process different for those two things? And how do you guide people in navigating each of those?
So the difference between like anticipatory grief when you're thinking about the loss versus
when it's just happened. Yeah.
When it's just, yeah. I mean, definitely two different things for sure. I would say anticipatory grief is the beginning of your grief journey. So with anticipatory loss, I have a lot of suggestions for how people can.
Yes, please. Yeah. We'd love to hear your suggestions.
So it's always going to be awkward, but having conversations with your loved one at that point, I recommend that people record something. And, iPhones just have a voice memo app that's really easy. You can have a conversation and be like, hey, I want to ask you some questions about your life. Putting that on the table, hitting record. You can do it over Zoom. You could do it over phone call. Even if it's just a 20 or 30 minutes that you're recording, I think it's really, really valuable. There's something called a kudo board that you can put images, poems, messages about a loved one. I think kudo board is really beautiful. So if you do know that someone's going to die, you can have their friends or family all put messages and photos and memories on this kudo board, and you can present it to that person. Here are these beautiful messages for you. It's also used for funerals, then it's cool to have heard about that person's life from different phases of their life. So some people use it before the person has died. Some people use it after, but if you can give them that gift while they're alive, I think that's really beautiful. I suggest people start with the dinner party or virtual grief groups. If they're in their 20s through 40s, something like that. I have a list that I send people. There's some books that I suggest people start reading. I'll list a few now. The Power of Now is one of my favorite books of all time by Eckhart Tolle. It is not specific to grief grief and loss. It is about living in the present moment and is extremely healing and helpful. That can be a gift for the person dying or for yourself. Modern Loss by Rebecca Sofer is a great book about grief for people who have lost someone. Like, there are all these beautiful stories about losses of like neighbors and teachers and people in your community. So that book is great. They also have an online platform, Modern Loss, with lots of grief quotes and inspiration, etc. Experience camps is something I suggest people get involved with. These are week-long grief camps for kids who have lost parents and siblings. It's completely free to the kids and to the volunteers. They have them in, I think, 5, maybe 6 states now. And getting involved with a camp like that has completely changed my life. If you do have the time to take a week off, not everyone does. They also do other virtual and in-person events. So just getting somehow involved in a grief community. I'm careful how I use those words because for some people, it is so overwhelming to think that they're going to be in a grief community. You can't just say like, join a grief group. But I can, send them an email with a lot more resources than I'm even saying now. So if anyone is experiencing anticipatory loss, I'd be happy to send you my email of resources. And you can find me at dyingoflaughterpodcast@gmail.com.
That's great. And we're going to repeat that again at the end. Maybe we'll even, if you're kind enough, put some of those resources in the show notes.
Sure, of course.
So you have talked a lot about all the ways in which you're supporting grieving people. I mean, it seems to be almost a full-time second career for you in addition to your career in the entertainment industry. I'm curious about how you separate or connect your sense of identity, given that so much of what you do is grief. Do you think of yourself as the grief person? Or is that a side component of who you are? And you think of yourself first and foremost as a comedian or an entertainer?
Yeah, interesting. I feel that over time, I'm becoming more and more of a grief person because I've been an actor and a comedian longer. That's what comes to mind first, just because I started doing that when I was 4 and the grief stuff has happened, in the last more 5 or 6 years. But over time, I find that that's becoming more and more a pillar of my identity. I also am pretty good about reminding myself that our tragedies do not define us, even though it's like my podcast and what I'm doing. Like, I still think it's important to have an identity outside of your biggest struggles. And I wanted to compliment you, Julia, and what you're doing in the space that you're holding for so many people with the ways that they create their family and establish and identify relationships within their families. It's interesting because you're doing this as a service to others, but it's also beneficial to yourself. But it's also like you are also more than this. Like, you also have a job and other things. Like, it's not just like Julia, single mom. Like, it's a part of who you are and it's a huge part of who you are. But how do you feel about your relationship to identity within relationship to your podcast?
It's totally right. And you're right that the more you dive into these things, I'm getting subsumed by it a little bit, but it's not the full and total. It's sort of like, how do you show up first? Like, what do you say when you are asked that question that I threw at you at the beginning? Who are you? You can choose to identify in any number of ways. I'm a funny person. I am a grief person. I am an actor or whatever. And for me, I'm in finance or I'm a single mom. Like, those two, whichever one you choose to lead with first, sets the tone, anchors the rest of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting.
So interesting. Well, so this is my last and final question, because you did just talk about the many ways in which we explore family dynamics. Mm-hmm. Given that you're holding so much space around grief, how has your definition of family evolved?
My definition of family has evolved in that your chosen family is just as important in many cases as your family by blood. I think as you get older, that becomes more clear. I've also learned a lot from Bianca's family, right? So for instance, now she at first was being raised by her mom with her cousin, and like that was its own family unit, although her cousin was very much her sister. Now she is living with her aunts and not with her cousin who she was living with. So it's like her family has really changed, and just being able to see her resilience around that has been really, really eye-opening. Also, the fact that I wasn't afraid to show up so regularly for someone that wasn't in my blood family was really powerful. It was scary. It was hard. It was uncomfortable. But I realized that was really meaningful for me. And, whatever she ends up remembering from it, it changed my life so deeply. And it has encouraged me to connect with more people outside of my blood family in these deep ways. And so if you're listening and you don't feel that you have a closeness to your blood family, and if you are experiencing anticipatory loss specifically, and you're just like, I don't know who to talk to because maybe there's no one else. Maybe your mom's dying and it's just you and your mom. Not being afraid to seek out the regular help and support of a therapist, of a grief counselor, of a friend, or someone in your life who is not in your blood family. They can be there for you. They can show up for you. And I hope that they do.
As you have. That's amazing. So we've talked about so many things, but one of the most important things is how we find you, because you are a wealth of knowledge, resources, comedy, humor, excellent podcasting, and so many other things, stand up, etc. Where do we find all of this?
We find all of this on Instagram at Chels Who Else. So my personal comedy account is Chels Who Else, as in who else would it be but Chels? You can also just Google Chelsea London Lloyd. I'll come up. And then my podcast account is at Dying of Laughter Podcast on Instagram. You can listen to the Dying of Laughter podcast wherever you get your podcast.
That's so awesome. I appreciate you so much spending the time today to talk about this heavy stuff. It's important, and I don't think we talk about it nearly enough. So hearing you bring humor, lightness, heaviness, all the stuff, the range of emotions to the table in an hour conversation is really amazing.
Yes, this was so wonderful. And if you're grieving or experiencing anticipatory grief, would love to talk with you. Feel free to shoot me a DM on Instagram, Dying of Laughter Podcast. If you just want to share your story, I'm happy to share resources or just learn more about you.
You're so right about being an expander, which actually brings us full circle to your haircut.
Right.
You're like, I want to expand. Well, thank you so much. And I appreciate your time.
And my haircut, I donated my hair in honor of Anna, and I got the certificate, and, it was for childhood cancer, but I put it in her honor, and I showed Bianca, look, this is, for your mom. It's a small thing, but it was nice.
It's not a small thing. The small things are the big things.
Thank you so much for having me, Julia. I so appreciate what you're doing and how you're continuing to show up. I'm really a fan of your podcast and the work that you are doing. So thank you so much for having me.
And I love yours and the work that you're doing. We're parallel approaches, different topic.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.
I am thrilled to share and extend a free level 2 subscription to the California Cryobank donor catalog. By using the promo code STORK'd, that's STORKD, at cryobank.com, you will receive free access for 90 days, which is an $145 value.